Somewhere between the ancient philosophers and this evening, a small number of thinking tools kept resurfacing. Physicists reached for one to strip a problem down to its parts. Investors reached for another to protect themselves from their own certainty. Judges, engineers, and quiet observers of crowds each arrived, independently, at a shortcut that worked more often than instinct alone. These tools go by an unglamorous name: mental models. Not tricks and not shortcuts to genius. Simply patterns that keep showing up wherever people think carefully for a living. Some come from economics, some from evolutionary biology, some from courtrooms and kitchens, and the private notebooks of scientists who never expected anyone else to read them. What follows is a collection of these models, gathered from history, mathematics, psychology, and the ordinary business of paying close attention. Some will describe a bias already living quietly in your own mind. Others will offer a way of looking at a problem you did not know you were allowed to look at differently. None of them promise certainty. Between them, they offer something closer to that, a wider set of angles from which to view a stubborn question. There is no correct order to learn these in, and no test waiting at the end. Settle in, let the pace stay slow, and take only what proves useful. We begin with a habit shared by nearly everyone who has ever made a decision they were still proud of years later, knowing, with real precision, what they did not know. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger built one of the most successful investment records in history, and a large part of the method was refusal. For decades, Buffett turned down businesses he did not understand, even while everyone around him was making money from them. During the technology boom of the late 1990s, he passed on software and internet companies while colleagues doubled their money, and he said plainly that he did not understand what he was looking at well enough to judge it. This habit has a name: the Circle of Competence. It is not a measure of how much a person knows. It is a boundary drawn honestly around the parts of the world where a person's judgment can actually be trusted. Inside that circle, you can weigh evidence, spot nonsense, and notice when something is wrong before it becomes expensive. Outside it, confidence stops being connected to accuracy, no matter how sure it feels from the inside. The trap is not ignorance. Ignorance is easy to spot and easy to admit. The trap is competence that quietly stops a little earlier than a person believes it does. A skilled engineer may reason superbly about bridges and poorly about medicine, while feeling equally confident in both conversations, because confidence is generated the same way, regardless of whether the underlying judgment is sound. Munger put the point bluntly: you do not have to be smarter than everyone else. You only have to be more honest, and most people are, about where your own understanding actually ends. Drawing the boundary is the hard part, harder than expanding it. It requires tracking, quietly and over years, which of your past judgments held up and which did not, then updating the map instead of defending it. Most people would rather feel like an expert everywhere than admit real expertise somewhere narrow and specific. The Circle of Competence asks for the opposite: a smaller claim held with far more confidence because it has actually been tested against results. The size of the circle matters less than most people assume. The investor, Charlie Munger, built much of his thinking around a single instruction, one he traced back to a 19th century mathematician named Carl Jacobi, who is said to have advised, "Invert, always invert." The idea sounds almost too simple to matter. If a problem resists you moving forward, turn around and walk it backward instead. Most people, faced with a goal, ask a version of the same question: how do I get there? Inversion asks a different one instead: what would guarantee that I never get there? And then works to avoid every item on that list. Munger applied this across a whole career of decisions by asking not how to be brilliant, but how to avoid being stupid, on the theory that avoiding a small number of serious mistakes does more for a lifetime of results than any number of clever ideas ever could. He noted that it is often far easier to identify what will surely ruin a plan than to identify what will surely make it succeed. The technique has old roots in mathematics, where certain proofs are far easier to complete by assuming the opposite of what you want to show than demonstrating that the assumption leads somewhere impossible. Engineers use a version of the same move when they design for failure first, asking what conditions would cause a bridge to collapse before they ask what conditions let it stand. A person planning a difficult conversation can ask what would make the conversation go as badly as possible, then simply decline to do those specific things, which turns out to be more useful advice than any list of things to do right. Forward thinking narrows quickly around the desired outcome. Working backward opens the view instead, because failure has so many more paths than success does, and each one, once named clearly, can be closed off in advance. Somewhere tonight, a difficult decision is being made easier simply by asking first, what would ruin it? Rocket engineers and ancient philosophers arrived, centuries apart, at the same piece of advice: strip a problem down to what is actually true, and build back up from there. Aristotle used the phrase first principles to describe the most basic truths within any field, the ones that cannot be deduced from anything simpler and must instead be established directly through observation or proof. Everything else in that field, he argued, should be built as a chain of reasoning from those foundations, rather than borrowed secondhand from what other people already happen to believe. Most everyday thinking works differently. It reasons by analogy. This new situation resembles an old one, so whatever worked before should work again. Analogy is fast and usually good enough, which is exactly why it dominates ordinary decisions. But it also quietly inherits every assumption baked into the old situation, including the ones nobody remembers agreeing to in the first place. First principles thinking refuses that inheritance. It asks what is fundamentally true, verifiable from physics, mathematics, or direct evidence, and then reconstructs a solution from that ground up, ignoring how things have conventionally been done. A well-known modern example involves the cost of rocket components. A manufacturer might quote a price for a specialized part, and an engineer reasoning by analogy would accept that price as simply the going rate. An engineer reasoning from first principles instead asks what the part is actually made of, what those raw materials cost, and what it would take to manufacture the part directly, sometimes arriving at a small fraction of the conventional price. The method is slower than analogy, and that is its main cost. Working out what is fundamentally true takes real effort, while borrowing an existing answer takes almost none. But analogy can only ever produce small variations on what already exists, while reasoning from the ground up occasionally produces something the old category had no room for at all. Most of what looks like a wall was only ever a habit, mistaken for a law. In the 1960s, the British and French governments began funding a supersonic passenger jet together. And by the time their own economists could show that the plane would never turn a profit, both governments kept paying for it anyway. The project became so associated with this pattern that economists sometimes call the trap itself the Concorde fallacy, named for the very plane that funded its own discovery. The reasoning inside that trap feels almost virtuous. So much has already been spent, the thinking goes, that stopping now would waste it all. But the money, the years, and the effort already spent are gone regardless of what happens next. They cannot be recovered by continuing. Continuing only risks losing more on top of what is already lost. Economists call these unrecoverable costs sunk costs, and the fallacy lies in treating them as a reason to keep going rather than as a cost that has already permanently been paid. A clear-headed decision looks only forward. Given where things stand right now, is continuing still the best use of the resources that remain? Past investment should have no vote in that question, yet it dominates the decision anyway, because abandoning a project feels like admitting the earlier spending was a mistake, and few things are less comfortable than that admission. Continuing lets a person defer the discomfort, even while making the eventual loss larger still. The fallacy shows up far from national infrastructure. It appears in a relationship kept going because of years already invested, a degree finished despite years of growing disinterest, a film watched to the end purely because of the hour already spent watching it. In each case, the honest question was never how much has already been spent. It is only ever what continuing will cost from this point forward, weighed fairly against what continuing might still deliver. The plane flew beautifully, right up until the day the arithmetic finally won. A 14th century friar named Occam left behind a principle so durable that scientists still reach for it 700 years later. When two explanations both fit the same facts, the simpler one deserves to be tested first. Occam was a Franciscan philosopher arguing mostly about theology and logic, and he never actually used the phrase now attached to his name. Later writers distilled his recurring argument that explanations should not multiply assumptions beyond what the evidence requires into the single tool now called Occam's razor. The razor is often misunderstood as a claim that the simplest explanation is always the true one. It claims something narrower and more useful than that. Between two explanations that account for the same observations equally well, the one that requires fewer new assumptions is the better place to start looking, because every extra assumption is one more thing that has to be true and one more chance to be wrong. Simplicity is a guide for where to direct attention first, not a guarantee of what reality turns out to contain. Doctors use a version of this every day, sometimes phrased as a saying about hoofbeats. When you hear them behind you, think of horses before you think of zebras. A common illness explains a symptom more often than a rare one does, so the common illness earns the first test, even though the rare illness remains possible and is never ruled out by the principle alone. Scientists lean on the same logic when a new theory is proposed alongside an older one that already explains the same data. The theory that adds the fewest new entities to the universe gets the benefit of the doubt, at least until evidence forces a more complicated picture into view. The razor cuts against elaboration for its own sake, not against complexity that the evidence genuinely demands. Reality is often complicated, and when it is, the honest answer keeps every assumption it needs and not one more. The idea that travels lightest is rarely the one that sounds cleverest. During the Second World War, the statistician Abraham Wald was asked by the United States military to help solve a practical problem. Where should extra armor be added to bomber aircraft, given that adding armor everywhere would make the planes too heavy to fly? The military had already gathered good data. Planes returning from missions were covered in bullet holes concentrated around the wings, the tail, and the body of the fuselage, while the engines showed comparatively few hits. The obvious recommendation was to reinforce the areas taking the most damage. Wald recommended the opposite, and he was right too. The bullet holes on returning planes showed only where a plane could be hit and still make it home. The planes hit in the engines mostly did not return at all, which meant the engines were missing from the data, not because they were rarely hit, but because a hit there was usually fatal. Wald reasoned that the armor belonged exactly where the surviving planes showed the least damage, since that particular damage pattern marked the hits a plane could not survive. This blind spot now has a name: survivorship bias, the error of drawing conclusions only from whatever managed to survive a selection process, while forgetting that the process itself removed the very examples that would have changed the conclusion. The bias hides well, because the survivors are, by definition, all a person can see. The failures leave quietly and take their evidence with them. The same blind spot reappears constantly, far from wartime aircraft. Success stories get studied far more closely than the failures that tried the identical strategy and vanished without leaving a story worth telling. A skyline of old, beautiful buildings can create the impression that architecture used to be better, when it is really that the poorly built structures from the same era collapsed or were demolished long ago, leaving only the sturdiest examples standing to be admired now. The absence of their evidence was never the absence of their number. A line of advice with a murky past has quietly become one of the most repeated principles in modern disagreement. Never attribute to malice what is adequately explained by carelessness. It travels under the name Hanlon's razor, credited to a man named Hanlon, who is said to have submitted the line to a joke book compilation around 1980. The exact origin is genuinely uncertain. Versions of the same sentiment appear earlier, loosely echoed by other writers across the preceding decades, which makes Hanlon less an inventor than the person whose name happened to stick to a truth other people had already been circling. The advice matters more than its authorship. When something goes wrong, a canceled plan, a curt reply, a missed deadline, the mind tends to reach first for intention. Someone meant this, someone was careless of me on purpose. Malice is a satisfying explanation because it makes sense of pain by giving it a source to blame. Carelessness is a far less satisfying explanation because it offers no target, only the flatter, more common truth that people are frequently distracted, overwhelmed, or simply not thinking about you at all. Hanlon's razor asks for the less satisfying explanation to be considered first, not because malice never exists, but because it is rarer than carelessness, and treating every failure as a personal attack invites a level of conflict that most situations never earned. A missed reply is far more often exhaustion than contempt. A short answer is far more often distraction than dismissal. A canceled plan is far more often a scheduling collision than a rejection. The razor is less a rule about other people than a rule about the story a mind is tempted to write when the real explanation is simply not available yet. Carelessness explains far more of the day than malice ever does. Offer most people a coin flip where heads wins them $100 and tails cost them $100, and most will decline even though the mathematics of the bet are perfectly even. The psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman spent years studying this reluctance and found something consistent across many versions of the experiment. For most people, a loss does not simply feel bad in proportion to how good a matching gain feels. It feels considerably worse. Their research placed the imbalance at somewhere around 2-to-1, meaning a loss is felt with something like twice the force of an equivalent gain. They called the broader theory built around this finding prospect theory, and the specific imbalance loss aversion. It helps explain why the coin flip above only becomes appealing to most people once the potential win climbs to somewhere around double the potential loss, not because anyone works out that arithmetic consciously, but because that is roughly the point where the smaller felt weight of the possible gain finally balances the larger felt weight of the possible loss. The asymmetry shapes decisions well beyond a hypothetical wager. Investors hold on to falling stocks longer than the evidence supports, because selling converts a paper loss into a real felt one, and that conversion is painful in a way that continuing to hold and continuing to hope is not. Negotiators who frame a compromise as a loss for the other side meet more resistance than negotiators who frame the identical compromise as a smaller gain, even when the numbers on the page are exactly the same. People will work harder to avoid losing $10 than they will work to gain that same $10, a pattern reliable enough that it gets built into the design of workplace incentives on purpose. Nothing about this makes losses more damaging in any objective sense. The damage is measured the same way on paper regardless of which direction it moves. Why would a mind treat an identical number so differently, depending only on its direction? Every action creates a consequence, and every consequence creates further consequences of its own, yet most decisions get made by weighing only the first link in that chain. A government caps the price of a good to make it more affordable for buyers, and that is a first-order effect, clearly visible and easy to celebrate. The second-order effect is quieter. Producers, unable to charge a price that covers their costs, produce less of the good, and the shortage that follows can leave buyers worse off than the original high price ever did. Thinking that stops at the first consequence is sometimes called first-order thinking, and it dominates most everyday reasoning simply because it is faster, and the first consequence is usually the most visible one. Second-order thinking asks one more question before settling on a decision. And then what happens? What happens once people, markets, or whole systems adjust to the change being proposed, rather than staying frozen exactly as they were the moment the decision was made? Medicine offers a gentler version of the same shape. A drug that relieves a symptom quickly is a clear first-order win, and only a longer view reveals whether it also quietly changes something else in the body that will matter months later. 20th century Australia offers an example still taught today. Farmers struggled with beetles destroying sugarcane crops, and in 1935, authorities introduced cane toads specifically to eat the beetles. The toads mostly ignored the beetles, which lived too high on the cane stalks to reach, and instead spread rapidly across the continent, poisoning native predators that tried to eat them. The first-order goal, fewer beetles, was reasonable enough on its own terms. The second-order consequence, a poisonous invasive species with no natural predators, was the cost nobody had priced in. The full cost of most choices tends to introduce itself only after the first celebration has already ended. Ask a group of people to spin a wheel of fortune rigged to stop on either the number 10 or the number 65. Then ask them to estimate what percentage of countries in the United Nations are African nations, and something strange happens. People who watched the wheel land on 10 guess low. People who watched it land on 65 guess considerably higher. The number from the wheel has nothing to do with the question that follows it, and every participant knows that, yet the arbitrary number still pulls their estimate toward itself. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran a version of this experiment and named the pattern the anchoring effect. Once a number enters the mind, even a number known to be meaningless, it becomes a reference point that later judgments drift toward, adjusting away from the anchor but rarely adjusting far enough to escape its pull entirely. The mind does not discard the irrelevant number. It quietly uses it as a starting point and edges away from there. Anchoring shapes negotiations in ways that are easy to exploit and hard to resist even once a person knows the trick. The first number spoken in a salary discussion or a price negotiation tends to set the emotional range for everything that follows, regardless of whether that opening number bears any relationship to fair value. A retailer who lists an item at a high original price beside a lower sale price is offering a deliberate anchor, and the discount feels larger simply because the higher number arrived first and set the frame. Knowing about anchoring does little to prevent it. Studies that tell participants about the effect directly, then run the wheel experiment again, still find estimates pulled toward the arbitrary number, only slightly less than before. A number that arrived by pure chance can still leave a mark that lingers long after the wheel has stopped spinning. Every choice a person makes is also, quietly, the choice to give up whatever the next best option would have delivered instead. Economists trace the term for this back to the Austrian economist Friedrich von Wieser, who wanted a name for a simple but easy-to-forget fact. Nothing is ever chosen in isolation. Choosing one thing is simultaneously choosing not to have the next best alternative. And that unchosen alternative carries a value, even though no receipt is ever issued for it. Money makes the idea easy to see. A person who spends $50 on a jacket has also declined whatever else $50 could have bought that day, and the jacket's true cost includes that declined alternative, not merely the price tag. Time makes the same idea harder to see, because time never sits in a visible account the way money does. An evening spent scrolling a phone has an opportunity cost too, whatever that evening's better use would have been, quietly forfeited, with nothing left behind to mark the loss. This invisibility is exactly what makes opportunity cost easy to ignore. A cost that involves handing over cash announces itself. A cost that involves simply not receiving some other unchosen benefit announces nothing at all. And a mind built to notice losses far more readily than absent gains will often miss it completely. Economists build entire models on the assumption that people weigh alternatives carefully before choosing. Most people, most of the time, weigh only the option directly in front of them against doing nothing, and never really compare it to the next best thing they could have done instead. A career chosen at 20 quietly forecloses several other careers that were never tried, and their absence never appears anywhere for comparison later. What could that same hour spent differently have quietly become instead? In a staged emergency, 85% of people helped within a minute when they believed they were the only witness. Add 4 passive strangers to the same room, instructed in advance to do nothing, and that figure fell to 31%. The person in trouble was the same, the emergency was the same, and the only thing that changed was how many other people appeared to be watching. The psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley built this experiment, and several others, following a widely reported New York murder case in 1964 that raised an uncomfortable question. Why do witnesses to an emergency sometimes fail to act? The original newspaper account of that case, which claimed dozens of neighbors watched and did nothing, was later shown by other journalists to have exaggerated key details. But the underlying question the case raised turned out to have a real, repeatable answer, independent of exactly how that one case actually unfolded. Latané and Darley called their answer diffusion of responsibility. When one person witnesses trouble alone, the full weight of responsibility to act sits on them and nowhere else. When a group witnesses the same trouble together, that responsibility splits quietly among everyone present, and each individual share shrinks enough that it becomes strangely easy to assume someone else will surely handle it. In another version of their research, participants filling out a questionnaire watched smoke begin seeping into the room through a vent. Those working alone reported it quickly. Those seated with passive strangers, quietly instructed to ignore the smoke, often sat through a room filling visibly with haze, glancing at the others, taking their unconcern as a signal that everything must be fine. A crowd is not a guarantee of help so much as the very thing that can talk each witness out of becoming one. In 1934, the investor Benjamin Graham, writing together with David Dodd, published a book called Security Analysis that introduced a simple discipline for buying anything of uncertain value. Never pay a price that only works out if your own analysis turns out to be correct. Build in room for being wrong. Graham called this room a margin of safety, and he borrowed the underlying intuition from engineering rather than finance. A bridge is never built to hold exactly the maximum weight engineers expect it to carry. It is built to hold considerably more than that, because materials vary, estimates carry error, and unexpected loads eventually arrive no matter how careful the original planning was. The gap between what a bridge can actually hold and what it is ever expected to hold is not waste. It is the very thing that keeps the bridge standing on the one day the estimate turns out to be wrong. Graham applied the identical logic to buying a business, or a share of one. If careful analysis suggests a company is worth a certain amount, a disciplined investor pays meaningfully less than that figure, not because the analysis is assumed to be sloppy, but because it might be in ways that only become visible later. The gap between the estimated value and the price actually paid absorbs the error that honest uncertainty always leaves behind. When the estimate holds up, the investor simply does well. When the estimate turns out to have been too optimistic, the margin is what keeps the mistake from becoming a disaster. The same discipline scales down easily to decisions with no numbers attached at all. A schedule built with no slack collapses at the first delay. A budget with nothing held back breaks at the first surprise. Confidence in your own judgment is not a reason to skip the buffer. It is, if anything, the exact moment a buffer is hardest to remember and most worth keeping. Certainty is rarely the sturdiest thing in the room, and the wisest plans tend to act as though they already know it. In 1960, the psychologist Peter Wason gave people a simple task. He showed them 3 numbers, 2, 4, 6, told them the sequence followed a hidden rule, and asked them to discover the rule by proposing their own sets of 3 numbers, receiving only a yes or no for whether each guess also fit. Most people quickly settled on a theory, something like even numbers rising by 2, and then spent every subsequent guess confirming it. They tried 8, 10, 12. Yes. They tried 20, 22, 24. Yes. Confident, they announced their rule, and were wrong. The actual rule was simply any 3 ascending numbers. Almost nobody tested that possibility because almost nobody tried a sequence designed to prove their own theory false. This pattern earned a name, confirmation bias, the tendency to search for, notice, and remember information that supports what a person already believes, while quietly passing over information that would challenge it. The bias rarely feels like bias from the inside. It feels like being right, since every fresh piece of evidence a person happens to notice keeps agreeing with them, without anyone stopping to ask whether the disagreeing evidence was ever actually looked for. The effect strengthens once a belief becomes attached to identity, rather than simple observation. A prediction about a stock, a political conviction, a diagnosis a doctor forms early in an appointment, all become harder to update honestly once holding the belief starts to feel like part of who a person is, rather than simply a claim that happens to be currently held. Wason's participants were not defending an identity. They were only defending a guess about 3 numbers, and the pull toward confirming it rather than testing it was still strong enough to fool almost everyone who attempted the task. Almost no one who found the rule for 2, 4, 6 thought to try 1, 2, 3, the one guess that would have broken it immediately. An old legend, likely Indian in origin and often linked to the invention of chess, tells of a king who offered its inventor any reward he wished to name. The inventor, in some versions of the story a sage named Sisa, asked for something that sounded almost comically modest: a single grain of wheat on the first square of the chessboard, then double that on the second square, then double again on the third, continuing to double all the way across all 64 squares. The king, amused by such a small request, agreed at once and ordered the wheat brought out. The doubling seemed harmless for the first several squares: 1 grain, 2, 4, 8, barely a handful by square 10. But doubling is a strange kind of arithmetic, quiet for a long stretch and then abruptly overwhelming. And by the time the count reached the far end of the board, the total had grown into more wheat than had ever been harvested across the whole of human history to that point. No king's granary, no kingdom's harvest could have paid the modest-sounding request in full. The legend survives because it captures something compounding growth does to intuition every single time. It is deceptive for a while, and then it is not deceptive at all. Because the early doubling stays small in absolute terms, growth that is compounding steadily can look, for a long stretch, indistinguishable from growth that is barely happening at all. Then the same rate of growth, applied to a base that has finally grown large enough, produces increases that dwarf everything that came before, seemingly overnight, though nothing about the underlying rate ever actually changed. The same shape appears in savings left to grow for decades, in populations, in the spread of an idea across a network of people who each tell only a few others. Whatever the field, the same warning survives across all of them. Early progress that looks unimpressive is not evidence the process is failing. Would anyone at that table have guessed the 64th square would outweigh the first 10 combined? People do not estimate risk by consulting statistics. Most of the time, they estimate it by how easily an example comes to mind. And those two measurements, ease of recall and actual frequency, are not the same thing at all. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman named this shortcut the availability heuristic, judging how common or likely something is by how readily examples of it surface in memory. The shortcut works reasonably well under ordinary conditions, since common events genuinely do tend to leave behind more memories and more mentions than rare ones. But the shortcut breaks cleanly whenever memorability and frequency come apart, which happens constantly in a world saturated with vivid, well-told stories about rare events. A plane crash is rare and catastrophic and covered by every news outlet for days, which means an image of one is extremely easy to summon. A car crash is far more common and almost never makes the news beyond a local report, which means no comparable image sits ready in most people's minds. Ask people to compare the danger of flying against the danger of driving the same distance, and the vivid, available image tends to win the comparison, even though the underlying statistics point firmly the other way. The heuristic explains why a single dramatic story can move public concern further than a mountain of quiet statistics ever could. It explains why people tend to overestimate the odds of dying in a way that makes a striking headline, and underestimate the odds of dying in a way that rarely gets reported at all. None of this requires bad information to be circulating. It only requires good information to be memorable in a way that has nothing to do with how often it actually happens. What comes to mind first is rarely a neutral sample of what is actually out there. In 1886, the scientist Francis Galton was studying how physical traits pass from parents to children, using sweet pea seeds and later human height, when he noticed something that seemed at first like it might disprove heredity entirely. The tallest parents in his data tended to have children slightly shorter than themselves. The shortest parents tended to have children slightly taller than themselves. Every extreme in either direction seemed to drift back toward the average with each generation. Galton called the pattern regression toward the mean, and it turned out to have nothing to do with heredity weakening over time. It is a feature of anything shaped partly by real underlying quality and partly by chance. An unusually tall parent is unusually tall due to some genuine combination of underlying factors, but also, to some extent, simply due to landing near the favorable end of ordinary random variation. That random component is not inherited at all, since it was random to begin with, so a child's height reflects the real underlying factors reliably, but rarely rides along with quite the same lucky draw of chance that pushed the parent to an extreme. The same pattern explains why a rookie athlete's spectacular debut season is so often followed by a merely good second one, why a business's best ever quarter is usually trailed by a more ordinary one, and why the single highest score on a difficult exam often gives way to a score closer to average on the next attempt. None of this requires declining talent or fading effort. It only requires that the original extreme result was partly luck, and luck, being random, does not reliably repeat itself. The danger lies in mistaking the dip for a decline. A rookie's slower second season gets read as failing to live up to potential, when it may only be the ordinary statistical cost of having had an exceptional first one. An extraordinary result rarely repeats itself exactly, and that alone is not evidence that anything has gone wrong. In 1981, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman gave two groups of people the exact same problem, worded two different ways, and got two very different sets of answers. Both groups were told to imagine a disease outbreak expected to kill 600 people, and both groups were offered a choice between two programs to fight it. The first group heard the programs described in terms of lives saved. One option would save 200 people for certain. The other offered a 1/3 chance of saving everyone and a 2/3 chance of saving no one. Most people in this group chose the certain option. The second group heard the exact same two programs described in terms of lives lost instead. One option would let 400 people die for certain. The other offered a 1/3 chance that nobody would die and a 2/3 chance that everyone would. Most people in this group chose the gamble. Read the numbers closely, and the two versions describe identical outcomes. Saving 200 out of 600 is mathematically the same as 400 dying. A 1/3 chance of saving everyone is the same gamble as a 1/3 chance of nobody dying. Nothing about the actual choice changed between the two groups. Only the words changed. Gain framed against loss framed, and that framing alone was enough to flip which option most people found acceptable. Tversky and Kahneman called this the framing effect. People do not evaluate outcomes on some neutral internal scale. They evaluate outcomes relative to how those outcomes are described, and a certain loss feels far more threatening than a certain gain of the identical size feels rewarding, which pushes people toward caution when a choice is framed as saving and toward risk when the identical choice is framed as losing. Advertisers, doctors describing a procedure's risk, and negotiators all reach for this same lever, sometimes without realizing they are pulling it. 90% fat-free describes the identical product as 10% fat, and only one of those two phrasings tends to sell. The same fact, worn differently, can talk a person into an entirely different decision. Picture a short description of a man named Steve. Quiet, meticulous, drawn to order and detail, with little interest in people or the wider world. Told that Steve was randomly drawn from a group made up mostly of farmers and a small number of engineers, most people still guess that Steve is more likely to be the engineer. The description sounds like an engineer is supposed to sound, and that resemblance overwhelms the plain statistical facts stated just a moment earlier, that engineers made up only a small slice of the group Steve was drawn from to begin with. This is base rate neglect, the tendency to ignore general statistical information called the base rate in favor of specific, vivid details about the individual case, even when the general information is the more reliable guide by far. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman documented the pattern repeatedly, and what makes it striking is how little the base rate actually needs to be hidden. In Steve's case, the base rate was stated outright moments before the guess was made, and people set it aside anyway, drawn toward the more vivid, story-shake detail instead. The neglect has real consequences well outside psychology experiments. A rare disease with a highly accurate test can still generate mostly false positive results, because when a condition is rare enough, even a small false positive rate applied to a huge pool of healthy people produces more false alarms than true cases, a fact that gets lost the moment an anxious patient is staring at one specific positive result and has no base rate in view. Juries weighing vivid specific testimony against dry statistical evidence tend to favor the vivid testimony, even when the statistics are the more trustworthy witness in the room. A specific detail feels like more evidence than a general statistic, regardless of which one is actually more likely to be true. In 1990, the researchers Daniel Kahneman, Richard Thaler, and Jack Netsch ran an experiment built around a plain coffee mug. Half the participants in a classroom were given a mug and asked the lowest price they would accept to sell it. The other half were given nothing and asked the highest price they would pay to buy an identical mug. Simple economic theory predicts these two numbers should land close together, since it is the same mug either way. They did not. The owners, on average, demanded roughly twice what the non-owners were willing to offer. Nothing about the mug changed by being handed to someone. What changed was ownership itself. And ownership, it turns out, quietly inflates how valuable a thing feels the moment it belongs to you. Thaler named this the endowment effect, and it connects closely to loss aversion, the finding that losses are felt more intensely than equivalent gains. Once a mug belongs to someone, giving it up registers, faintly but measurably, as a loss, and losses are guarded against more fiercely than gains are ever pursued. The non-owner, by contrast, is only ever contemplating a potential gain, which the mind simply does not defend with the same urgency. The effect shows up well beyond mugs and classrooms. Homeowners routinely price their homes above what comparable buyers are willing to pay, not out of dishonesty, but because the home has quietly become part of an endowment, rather than simply an asset for sale. A trial period that lets a customer use a product for 30 days before deciding whether to buy it works, in part, because by day 30, the product no longer feels like something being considered. It feels like something already owned, and walking away from it has started to feel like a small loss, rather than simply the decision not to make a purchase. Ownership does not just change who holds a thing, it quietly changes what letting go of it costs. Around the turn of the 20th century, the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto noticed something odd while studying land ownership in Italy. Roughly 80% of the land belonged to roughly 20% of the population. Pareto was not searching for a universal law when he noticed it. He was simply cataloging property records. But the lopsided ratio stayed with him, and later thinkers noticed the same rough shape appearing in places that had nothing to do with land at all. The pattern now carries his name, the Pareto principle, sometimes shortened to the 80-20 rule. In many systems, a small share of the causes tends to account for a large share of the effects. A small fraction of a company's customers often account for most of its revenue. A small fraction of a piece of software's code often contains most of its bugs. A small fraction of a person's daily tasks often produce most of the meaningful progress made that day, while the rest amounts to motion without much result. The exact numbers 80 and 20 are not a law of nature. They are a rough label for a lopsided shape that shows up constantly, sometimes closer to 70-30, sometimes closer to 90-10, rarely landing on the tidy split people repeat as though it were precise. What holds up across the variations is the underlying imbalance itself. Effort and results are almost never evenly distributed, no matter how evenly a task list makes them look on paper. The practical use of the principle is not the arithmetic. It is the reminder to go looking for the small fraction actually doing the work, rather than treating every task, customer, or line of code as though each were contributing an equal share. Most of what matters in any system tends to hide inside a smaller share of it than anyone expects. In the early 20th century, the psychologist Thorndike asked military officers to rate soldiers under their command on a range of separate qualities: physical bearing, intelligence, leadership, character. The ratings should have varied independently, since a soldier could plausibly be physically impressive and intellectually unremarkable, or the reverse. Instead, Thorndike found the ratings clustered together tightly. Officers who rated a soldier highly on one quality tended to rate that same soldier highly on nearly every other quality too, regardless of whether the officer had actually observed anything relevant to that second trait. Thorndike named the pattern the halo effect, a single strong impression, often based on something as simple as appearance or an initial encounter, spreading outward to color judgment of entirely unrelated qualities. The mind, faced with a person or a product, seems to prefer a single, coherent overall impression over a set of separately reasoned judgments, and it builds that coherent impression by letting the most visible trait quietly stand in for all the others. The effect shows up constantly outside military rosters. Attractive people are rated, on average, as more competent, more trustworthy, and more intelligent by people who have no actual evidence of their competence, trustworthiness, or intelligence at all, only their appearance. A well-designed product is assumed to be more reliable than a clumsily designed one, even when the internal engineering is identical. A confident speaker is trusted more readily than a hesitant one, regardless of whether confidence and accuracy have any relationship to each other in that particular case. The halo effect works quietly because it never feels like guessing. It feels like a single well-earned impression, formed all at once and confirmed from every angle. When it was really formed once, from one angle and simply repeated back with each new question asked. One good impression, left unexamined, is happy to answer for qualities it never actually saw. In 1955, a British naval historian named Northcote Parkinson published a short, wry essay in a magazine, opening with a line that turned into one of the most quoted observations about bureaucracy ever written. Work expands to fill the time available for its completion. He had spent years observing the British civil service, and he had noticed something that seemed to defy common sense. The number of administrative staff kept climbing steadily year over year, even during long stretches when the actual workload, and even the size of the empire those staff were meant to administer, was shrinking. Parkinson worked out a rough mechanism for the pattern. An overworked official, rather than admit the job was too big for one person, tends to hire two subordinates rather than one capable equal. Since two subordinates can be safely outranked, while a single equal might become a rival. Those two subordinates then generate enough internal memos, meetings, and reports to justify hiring further subordinates of their own. And the whole structure grows steadily, independent of whether there is more actual work to justify the growth. The same principle scales down easily to a single afternoon. A task with a generous deadline reliably takes nearly the entire deadline to finish, filled out with extra meetings, extra revisions, and extra polish that a tighter deadline would have quietly skipped, without the final result necessarily improving to match the extra time spent. Give the identical task a tight, honest deadline instead, and it often gets finished in a fraction of the time, at a quality difficult to tell apart from the slower version. A 2-week deadline for a report and a 2-day deadline for the identical report can produce documents of oddly similar quality once the padding a longer deadline invites gets stripped back out. A task rarely tells you how long it truly needs, only how long it was given. In 1948, the psychologist Bertram Forer gave a personality test to 39 of his students, then handed each of them what he described as a unique written analysis of their individual results. He asked each student to rate on a 5-point scale how accurately the analysis captured their personality. The average rating came back remarkably high, well above 4 out of 5, striking for a supposedly individualized reading. Forer then revealed the trick. Every student had received the exact same written analysis, word for word, assembled from vague statements lifted from a newspaper astrology column. The statements worked because they were built to work on almost anyone. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. At times you have serious doubts about whether you made the right decision. You pride yourself on being an independent thinker. Each line sounds personal because each line is broad enough to be true of nearly every reader who encounters it, while still feeling, in the moment of reading it, like a description written specifically about them and no one else. This tendency to accept vague general statements as uniquely personal insight became known as the Barnum effect, named for the showman Barnum, famous for entertainment built to appeal to the broadest possible crowd, and it is also called the Forer effect, after the psychologist who first demonstrated it cleanly. Horoscopes, generic personality quizzes, and cold reading performances all lean on the identical mechanism. Offer a broad statement with enough emotional texture, and most listeners will supply their own specific memory to match it, then credit the statement itself with the accuracy their own memory quietly provided for free. Professional cold readers use the identical trick live, watching a listener's face for the smallest flicker of recognition, then leaning harder into whichever vague statement just landed, letting the listener do the specific work of connecting it to their own life. The words were never wrong about you. They were simply never about you at all. In 1975, the British economist Goodhart published a paper on monetary policy that included a dense, technical observation about how financial statistics behave once policymakers start relying on them to steer the economy. His actual point was narrow and academic, but over the following 2 decades, other writers boiled that observation down into a single, sharper sentence that Goodhart himself never actually wrote. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. The idea in its popularized form is straightforward once stated plainly. Any measurement used only to observe a system can be trusted roughly to reflect what is actually happening. The moment that same measurement becomes the official target people are rewarded or punished for hitting, people begin optimizing for the number itself rather than for the underlying thing the number was only ever meant to represent, and the two can drift apart quickly. A school system that starts rewarding teachers based purely on standardized test scores can see those scores climb, while genuine learning stalls or even declines, because instruction quietly reorganizes itself around the test, rather than around the wider goal the test was only ever meant to approximate. A customer service team measured purely on how quickly calls end can see call times fall sharply, while customers hang up with their actual problems still unsolved, because the fastest way to end a call is not always to help the caller. A hospital measured purely on emergency room wait times can see those times fall, while patients are quietly reclassified or shuffled between rooms in ways that make the clock look better without making anyone healthier. None of this requires anyone involved to be dishonest. It only requires a system smart enough to notice which number is actually being graded, and to optimize for that number, rather than for the harder-to-measure thing it was only ever supposed to represent. The number was never the point. It only ever pointed at the point, and pointing is not the same as being it. The Sydney Opera House was expected to take about 4 years to build and cost around $7 million. It opened 10 years behind that original schedule, at a final cost of roughly $102 million, nearly 14 times the first estimate. The building became one of the most recognized structures on Earth. It also became a textbook example of a pattern the psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky named in 1979. The planning fallacy. The tendency to underestimate how long a task will take, how much it will cost, and how much can go wrong along the way, even when a person has every reason, from long experience, to know better. What makes the planning fallacy strange is how little it responds to hindsight. People who have personally lived through a previous project running late still underestimate the next one. Kahneman and Tversky traced part of the problem to a simple habit of mind. When asked to predict how long a task will take, most people picture the smoothest, realistic version of events, quietly leaving out the version where a supplier is late, a design has to change, or an unexpected complication appears partway through. The smooth version is not dishonest. It is simply the easiest version to imagine in detail, and the mind mistakes ease of imagining for likelihood. Outside observers, asked to estimate the same task without any stake in the optimism, are consistently more accurate, since they carry no attachment to the smooth version and no motivation to prefer it. This gap gave rise to a modest but genuinely useful correction called reference class forecasting. Instead of estimating a project from the inside based on its own specific plan, estimate it from the outside based on how long similar projects have actually taken in the past, then adjust the comfortable internal estimate to match that outside history. Every plan is a story about the future, told by someone who has a reason to prefer the shorter version. In the early 20th century, the scholar Korzybski coined a short phrase meant to correct a mistake he believed people make constantly without noticing. The map is not the territory. A map of a mountain range is enormously useful and also unavoidably incomplete. It leaves out the smell of the pine trees, the exact texture of the loose rock underfoot, the way weather changes the danger of one specific slope on one specific afternoon. A hiker who mistakes the map itself for the actual mountain, trusting it beyond what it can honestly offer, is the one who runs into trouble when reality turns out to hold details the map was never built to carry. Korzybski's point reached well beyond literal cartography. Every model, theory, word, and category a person uses to describe the world is a kind of map, a useful simplification standing in for something far more detailed and complicated than the simplification can ever fully capture. Economic models are maps of economies. Diagnostic categories are maps of the huge range of ways a human body can go wrong. A job title is a map of everything a person actually does in a given day. Each is useful precisely because it strips away detail, and each becomes dangerous the moment it gets mistaken for the full, undiminished thing it was only ever meant to represent. The error is not in making maps. Maps are necessary since the full territory is usually too large and too detailed to hold in mind all at once. The error is forgetting that a map was ever made and beginning to argue with reality itself when reality declines to match the simplified version carried around in its place. Somewhere, a very good map is currently being mistaken for the ground it was only ever drawn to represent. In 1969, the educator Lawrence Peter and the writer Raymond Hull published a book with a mischievous central claim. In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to the level of their own incompetence. The logic behind the claim is almost uncomfortably simple. People get promoted because they performed well in their current role. That promotion moves them into a new role requiring different skills, and if they perform well there too, they get promoted again and again until they eventually land in a role that finally exceeds what they are actually good at. At that point, since further promotion no longer follows from a poor performance the way it once followed from a strong one, they typically stay exactly there, in the one role they turn out to be worse suited for the remainder of their career. Peter and Hull framed the idea as satire, dressed up with the trappings of a serious academic theory, but the underlying observation touched a nerve precisely because so many people recognized it immediately from their own workplace. A brilliant engineer promoted into management is not automatically a brilliant manager, since the two roles reward almost entirely different skills, and yet the promotion ladder generally offers no other direction to climb. A gifted teacher promoted into school administration loses the very classroom skill that earned the promotion in the first place and gains an entirely different job that skill never actually prepared them for. The pattern persists because organizations mostly measure people on how well they perform their current job, which is only ever weak evidence for how well they would perform some future, different one. A track record proves competence at the job already being done. It proves nothing at all about the next job up the ladder, which is precisely the job the promotion is being decided on. Competence, it turns out, is the very thing that keeps pushing a person past the point where they still have it. In 1929, the writer Chesterton offered a small parable that has since become a standard piece of advice for anyone eager to reform an old rule or an old institution. Imagine, he wrote, a fence built across a road for no reason you can currently see. A certain kind of reformer looks at that fence and says, "I cannot see the use of this. Let us clear it away." A more careful thinker gives a different answer. "If you cannot see the use of it, I certainly will not let you clear it away. Go away and think, and when you can come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it." The parable is not an argument for leaving every old rule exactly as it stands forever. Chesterton was not defending the fence itself. He was defending the requirement to understand why a fence was built before deciding it should come down. Old rules and old institutions usually exist because they solved some real problem for someone at some point, even if that original problem has since faded from memory or stopped applying to current circumstances. A rule that looks pointless today may simply be a rule whose original purpose nobody bothered to write down, or a purpose that quietly became invisible once the rule started working well enough that the problem it solved stopped happening. Removing the fence without understanding it risks reintroducing exactly the problem the fence was quietly solving the whole time, invisible precisely because it had already been solved. This does not mean every fence deserves to stay. Some genuinely have outlived their purpose. It only means the decision to remove one should follow an honest answer to why it was built, not simply an inability to currently think of a reason. The fence that looks most pointless is sometimes the one doing the most invisible work. In a study published in 2012, the researchers Norton, Moshon, and Ariely asked participants to assemble a simple piece of storage furniture themselves, then asked how much they would pay for it. A separate group was shown an identical, already assembled version of the same furniture, and asked to name their own price. The people who built the furniture themselves, with their own hands, valued it substantially higher than the people who were simply shown the finished, professionally built version, even though the two objects, once complete, were functionally the same. The researchers named the pattern the IKEA effect, after the furniture retailer known for shipping products that customers assemble themselves at home. Labor, it turns out, does something to perceived value that has little to do with the quality of the labor involved. Even clumsy amateur assembly, the kind that leaves a shelf slightly uneven or a screw visibly crooked, still raised how much a person valued the finished object, simply because they were the ones who had put it together. Part of the effect seems to come from a basic form of self-attribution, An object a person struggled with, however slightly, becomes bound up with their own effort and their own small triumph in finishing it, and downgrading that object afterward starts to feel a little like downgrading the effort itself. Companies have leaned into the discovery deliberately. Meal kits that require a customer to do some of the cooking, furniture that requires some assembly, recipes that ask for one homemade addition to a mostly prepared dish, all borrow the same mechanism, offering just enough labor to generate ownership without demanding so much labor that the task becomes a burden instead of a source of quiet pride. Effort has a way of quietly relabeling itself as value once it is folded into a finished thing. An old joke describes a police officer who finds a man on his hands and knees late at night, searching the ground beneath a streetlight. The officer asks what he lost. "My keys," the man says. The officer helps him search for several minutes before asking exactly where the man dropped them. "Over there," the man says, pointing toward a dark stretch of the street well beyond the light. "Then why are you searching here?" the officer asks. "Because this is where the light is," the man replies. The joke is old enough that nobody can say for certain where it began, but it earned a permanent place in research and policy circles under a plain descriptive name, the streetlight effect. It names a specific and common failure of judgment, searching for an answer in the place that is easiest to search, rather than the place where the answer actually is, simply because the easy place is well lit and the true place is not. Scientific research is not immune to the pattern. Some questions get studied heavily, not because they matter more, but because they can be measured with tools and methods that already exist, while equally important questions go quietly understudied for decades simply because nobody has built a convenient way to examine them yet. Public policy shows the same pull. Problems that generate clean, countable statistics attract funding and attention, while problems that resist easy counting, even devastating ones, struggle to compete for the same resources, not because they matter less, but because their evidence is harder to drag into the light. The danger is subtle, because searching under the streetlight is not lazy in any obvious sense. It can look from the outside exactly like diligence. The search is thorough, the light is simply in the wrong place. Some of the most important questions are still waiting in the dark stretch of street nobody has bothered to walk toward. In 1999, two psychologists named Dunning and Kruger described an effect that quickly became one of the most repeated ideas in modern psychology, and, in the years since, one of the most argued over. Their original claim was specific. People with the least skill or knowledge in a particular domain tend to overestimate their own ability in that domain by the widest margin, because the very expertise required to perform a task well is often the same expertise required to accurately judge how well the task was performed at all. The idea spread quickly, often flattened into a simpler, punchier version than the original research actually supported. The least competent people are the most confident. That flattened version became a kind of cultural shorthand for a certain type of overconfident amateur, repeated constantly online and in casual conversation, usually stripped of any of its original nuance. More recent statistical critiques, including work by researchers such as Gilles Guignac and Marcin Zajękowski, have argued that a meaningful portion of the original pattern may be a statistical artifact rather than a purely psychological one, produced partly by regression to the mean and by the specific way ability and confidence were measured and compared in the original studies. Under this critique, some of the apparent overconfidence among low scorers and underconfidence among high scorers would appear even in randomly generated data with no real psychological effect driving it at all. None of this means the underlying caution is worthless. Genuine beginners in a field frequently do not yet know enough to see the size of what they do not know, which is a real observation, separate from the disputed statistical claim about a precise curve of overconfidence. What the debate mainly counsels is a smaller claim than the popular version usually makes. The effect's exact size and its exact shape are still genuinely unsettled. The least useful confidence is often the confidence that has never yet been tested against anything. In 2012, the writer and former options trader, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, published a book built around a word he had to invent: because he could not find an existing one for the concept he wanted to describe. Resilient things survive shocks and disorder. Fragile things break under them. But Taleb wanted a name for a third category, one that actually improves because of shocks and disorder, and no word in the existing language quite captured it. He called the concept anti-fragility. A human bone offers a clean example. Moderate repeated stress, the kind produced by walking, running, and lifting, does not merely fail to damage bone. It actively signals the body to lay down more bone density in response, so that bone subjected to sensible stress over time becomes stronger than bone kept in total, careful rest. A muscle works the same way, tearing slightly under exertion and rebuilding thicker than before. Rest alone with no stress at all produces the opposite outcome in both cases. Weaker bone, weaker muscle, a body quietly worse prepared for the next demand placed on it. Taleb argued that certain systems built by people share the identical property when they are designed correctly. A small business with low fixed costs and no single dependency it cannot survive losing can sometimes come out of an economic shock stronger than before, having absorbed the failure of weaker competitors and inherited their customers. A decentralized system made of many small, replaceable parts can often absorb the loss of any single part better than a large, efficient, tightly coupled system built to run perfectly only as long as nothing ever goes wrong with it. A small, well-diversified portfolio of investments can behave the same way, gaining slowly from the ordinary churn of weak companies failing and stronger ones taking their place, rather than merely enduring that churn. Sturdy only survives a storm. Anti-fragile spends the storm quietly getting stronger. European writers spent roughly 1,600 years using the black swan as a stock example of something that could not possibly exist. A shorthand for pure logical impossibility, since every swan anyone had ever documented on the continent was white. Then, in 1697, a Dutch expedition led by Willem de Vlaming sailed into a river in what is now Western Australia and found the riverbanks lined with swans that were entirely, unmistakably black. The impossible example turned out to be merely unobserved. The writer Nassim Nicholas Taleb borrowed the phrase for a 2007 book and gave it a new, more specific meaning, one built directly around what had happened to the original swans. A black swan event, in Taleb's definition, is an occurrence that is rare, carries enormous impact when it happens, and only looks predictable after the fact, explained away with a tidy story once it is far too late for the story to be of any use. Taleb called this retrospective tidiness the narrative fallacy, the habit of arranging past events into a clean story only after the outcome is already known. Before the event, the available evidence points reasonably toward its impossibility, exactly the way centuries of only ever seeing white swans reasonably pointed toward the impossibility of any other kind. The danger Taleb described is not merely that black swan events happen. It is that people, systems, and institutions consistently build their planning around the world as it has been observed so far, treating the boundaries of past experience as though they were the boundaries of what can actually occur. A financial model built entirely on decades of historical data has no way of representing a catastrophe that has simply never happened yet within that data, right up until the day it does. The swans were never actually impossible. There had simply never been a boat that sailed far enough to find them. In 1950, two researchers at the Rand Corporation named Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher designed a simple game meant to study cooperation and betrayal under conditions where two players cannot communicate with each other. A colleague of theirs, the mathematician Albert Tucker, later gave the game a name and a memorable story to go with it, built around two prisoners held in separate rooms, and the name stuck permanently, The Prisoner's Dilemma. The setup is simple. Two prisoners, unable to speak to each other, are each offered the same private deal. Betray your partner and stay silent yourself, and you go free while your partner receives a heavy sentence. If you both betray each other, you both receive a moderate sentence. If you both stay silent, you both receive only a light sentence, the best outcome available to the pair as a whole. But neither prisoner can see or trust what the other is about to choose, and betrayal always produces a better individual outcome than silence does, regardless of what the other prisoner decides. Pure self-interested reasoning points each prisoner toward betrayal, and the two of them, reasoning identically and separately, arrive together at the one outcome that is worse for both of them than mutually silence would have been. The dilemma became one of the most studied structures in game theory, precisely because it captures a shape found constantly outside of prisons. Two companies competing on price can both benefit from quietly holding prices steady, yet each is individually tempted to undercut the other, and rational self-interest, followed by both sides, drags them into a price war that leaves both of them worse off than cooperation would have. Nations negotiating over emissions, neighbors deciding whether to maintain a shared fence, colleagues deciding whether to cut corners on a joint project, all inherit some version of the identical structure. Two people, each making the individually smartest choice available to them, can still walk away having made together the dumbest possible choice there was. In 1950, John Nash, then a 22-year-old mathematics student, completed a doctoral thesis barely 27 pages long that would eventually reshape the field of economics and earn him a share of the Nobel Prize more than 4 decades later. The thesis described a general condition that could apply to almost any competitive situation involving multiple decision-makers, a condition now called the Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is a state in which every participant has chosen the best strategy available to them, given the strategies everyone else has chosen, such that no single participant can improve their own outcome by changing only their own choice. Nobody has to be happy with the outcome for it to qualify. Nobody has to think the result is fair or even good. The only requirement is that every player is currently doing the best they individually can, given what everyone else in the situation is doing, which means nobody has any private incentive left to switch strategies on their own. The prisoner's dilemma, described elsewhere in this collection, produces exactly this kind of equilibrium, mutual betrayal, even though both prisoners would prefer mutual silence, because neither prisoner can improve their own outcome by unilaterally switching back to silence, while the other continues to betray. That is precisely what makes it an equilibrium, rather than simply an unfortunate outcome. It is stable, in the narrow sense that no individual player has any private reason to move away from it, even while the group as a whole would clearly be better off somewhere else entirely. Nash's insight was proving that this kind of stable point exists across an enormous range of competitive situations, not merely in the handful of simple games earlier theorists had already worked out by hand. Traffic patterns, business competition, arms negotiations between nations, and evolutionary competition between species can all be examined through the same basic lens. A stable outcome is not the same thing as a good one. It is simply the point where nobody left standing has any private reason left to move. In 1968, the ecologist Garrett Hardin published an essay in the journal Science, built around an old, simple scenario. Picture a shared pasture, open to every herder in a village, with no single owner, and no restriction on how many animals any one herder can graze there. Each herder, reasoning entirely from their own self-interest, gains the full benefit of adding one more animal to their own herd, while the cost of that additional animal, in the form of a slightly more worn-down, slightly less productive shared pasture, gets spread thinly across every herder using the land, including all the herders who did not add an animal at all. From any single herder's perspective, the rational move is always to add one more animal, since the herder captures the full private benefit, while paying only a small fraction of the shared cost. But every herder using the pasture faces the identical incentive, and if all of them follow it, as the logic suggests they individually should, the shared pasture gets overgrazed and eventually collapses, leaving every herder involved worse off than if some shared restraint had been agreed upon and enforced from the start. Hardin called this pattern the tragedy of the commons. A resource shared without restriction gets consumed faster than it can renew itself, not through anyone's malice, but through everyone's individually reasonable use of it. The pattern reappears wherever a resource is shared and unrestricted. Ocean fisheries, open to any vessel willing to sail out, have collapsed under this exact logic more than once. Groundwater drawn freely by every well in a region can fall faster than rain replenishes it. A shared office refrigerator, a shared internet connection, a shared atmosphere absorbing carbon from every source at once, all follow some version of the identical shape, differing mainly in scale and in how visible the eventual collapse becomes. What ruins a commons is rarely any single herder acting badly. It is every herder acting reasonably, all at once, with nobody positioned to see the whole pasture at the same time. In Lewis Carroll's 1871 story Through the Looking Glass, a chess piece called The Red Queen keeps running while the landscape around her moves in exactly the opposite direction, so that no matter how fast she runs, she stays in precisely the same place. It takes all the running you can do, she tells a bewildered Alice, to keep in the same place. In 1973, the evolutionary biologist Lee Van Veerlen borrowed the image for a serious scientific proposal. Studying the fossil record, Van Veerlen noticed that species do not simply improve steadily over time and then coast on their advantage. Instead, a species tends to keep going extinct at a roughly constant rate across long stretches of geological time, regardless of how much it has already evolved and improved. Van Veerlen's explanation was that a species is never really competing against a fixed, unchanging environment. It is competing against other living species, predators, prey, parasites, and rivals, all of whom are simultaneously evolving too, which means the environment a species must keep pace with is constantly shifting out from under it. A faster gazelle does not gain a lasting advantage over its predators because the pressure that fast gazelle now places on the local cheetah population selects over generations for faster cheetahs in turn. The cheetahs that evolve to match do not fall behind, and neither species ever gets to enjoy a permanent lead because the other is evolving in response the entire time. Both run, generation after generation, and both stay, in relative terms, in almost exactly the same place they started. Van Veerlen named the pattern the Red Queen hypothesis, and it reframed evolution as less a ladder climbing steadily upward, and more a treadmill, one that every species must keep pace with, simply to avoid quietly falling behind and disappearing. Standing still in a world where every rival keeps moving was never actually standing still at all. Add fertilizer to a field of crops, and the first application tends to produce a large, clearly visible jump in yield. Add a second, identical application, and the yield rises again, but by a smaller amount than the first time. Add a third and the gain shrinks further still, until eventually another application of fertilizer adds almost nothing at all. And past a certain point, adding still more can actually begin to harm the crop rather than help it. Economists have described this pattern for centuries under the name diminishing returns. Past a certain point, each additional unit of a single input produces a smaller additional output than the unit before it did, even while every other factor involved stays exactly the same. The pattern is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is closer to a structural fact about how inputs and outputs relate to each other once one input keeps increasing, while everything else involved, the size of the field, the amount of sunlight, the available water, holds steady around it. The same shape appears constantly outside of agriculture. A student's first hour of studying for an exam typically teaches far more than their fifth consecutive hour that same night, once fatigue and diminishing attention start eating into whatever additional hour gets added. A company's first few hires onto a small, understaffed team often transform what the team can accomplish, while the 20th hire onto an already large team may add only a marginal sliver of extra output, since coordination costs quietly rise alongside every new person added to a group. A runner's first few weeks of training typically produce dramatic gains in speed, while months 7 and 8 of identical training produce far smaller improvements as the easy, early gains get claimed first, and what remains gets steadily harder to reach. The first push on anything tends to move it further than the 10th push ever will. Place a microphone too close to the speaker it is feeding, and a small, ordinary sound gets picked up, amplified, sent back out through the speaker, picked up again, amplified again, and within a fraction of a second, the sound has grown into a piercing screech, far louder than anything that started it. Nothing new entered the system after that first small sound. The system simply began feeding its own output back into its own input, and the effect compounded on itself far faster than anyone standing nearby could react to it. Engineers and scientists studying systems that regulate themselves call this a feedback loop, and they generally sort feedback loops into two broad categories. A reinforcing feedback loop, like the microphone, takes a change and amplifies it further in the identical direction, which can spiral quickly out of control if nothing eventually intervenes to break the cycle. A balancing feedback loop does the opposite, working to cancel a change out and return a system back towards some steady state. A household thermostat is the clean, ordinary example. As a room grows warmer than its target temperature, the thermostat responds by cooling it, and as the room grows colder than that same target, the thermostat responds by warming it, continuously correcting in whichever direction restores balance. Both kinds of loop appear constantly outside of physical machinery. A bank run behaves like a reinforcing loop. A handful of worried customers withdrawing their money makes other customers more worried, which drives further withdrawals, which increases the original worry further still, entirely independent of whether the bank was ever actually in trouble to begin with. A habit supported by a friend group behaves more like a balancing loop, with social feedback nudging behavior gently back toward whatever the group already considers normal whenever someone starts to drift too far from it in either direction. Small changes, fed back into themselves enough times, rarely stay small for very long. A single ant follows a small set of simple rules. Leave a chemical trail while walking. Follow trails other ants have already left when one happens to be stronger than wandering blindly, and react to a small handful of local signals from whatever ants happen to be nearby. No individual ant has anything resembling a plan for the colony as a whole. No individual ant knows where the nearest food source is, how many other ants are currently foraging, or what the colony's overall strategy should be this week. Yet a colony built from thousands of these simple, planless individuals reliably finds efficient paths to food, allocates workers between tasks in response to changing conditions, and defends itself with a coordination that looks, from a distance, remarkably like intention. This gap between what any single part is doing and what the whole system accomplishes has a name: emergence. A property is called emergent when it exists at the level of the whole system but cannot be found in or predicted from any single component examined on its own. No single ant is intelligent about colony logistics. The colony as a whole behaves as though it is. The same shape appears in a flock of starlings turning together in the sky in what is called a murmuration. Thousands of birds banking and reforming in patterns that look choreographed from the ground, even though each individual bird is only ever reacting to the small handful of neighbors closest to it, with no leader, no plan, and no bird holding any picture of the flock's overall shape. Neurons offer perhaps the most striking example available. A single neuron is not conscious of anything and cannot think in any meaningful sense of the word. Enough neurons, wired together in the right pattern and firing in coordination, produce a mind, complete with memory, emotion, and the very capacity now being used to read and consider this sentence. Nothing about the parts explains the whole, and yet the whole is made of absolutely nothing else. In 1992, the anthropologist Robin Dunbar published research comparing the size of the neocortex, the outer wrinkled layer of the brain most associated with complex thought, across different species of primates. Across species, he found a consistent relationship. Primates with a larger neocortex relative to the rest of their brain tended to live in larger, more complex social groups, as though processing a bigger social world simply required more of that particular brain tissue to manage it. Applying the same relationship to the human neocortex, Dunbar's calculation produced a number that has followed him ever since, roughly 150, the approximate upper limit of stable social relationships one human mind can realistically track and maintain at once. The number is commonly rounded to 150 and treated in popular retellings as more precise than Dunbar himself ever claimed it to be. His own estimate carried a fairly wide range around that figure, and the underlying idea matters more than the exact digit. Human social cognition has some genuine upper bound, a point past which a person can still recognize more faces than that and still hold cordial acquaintance with more people than that, but can no longer track the full web of relationships, histories, and social standing that a relationship a person would call genuinely close actually requires. What makes the number striking is not the neuroscience alone, it is how often roughly the same figure shows up, independently across human history, in contexts that had no access to Dunbar's later research. Historical armies frequently organized their basic fighting units at a size somewhere close to 150. Hunter-gatherer communities, studied across widely separated regions of the world, often cluster around a similar figure, for a stable functioning band. Some companies, aware of the research, deliberately cap individual office or team sizes near the same rough number, on the theory that a group larger than that stops functioning as a single cohesive community and starts quietly splintering into smaller ones anyway. Somewhere past a number nobody agreed upon in advance, a group of familiar faces has always tended to become two. In the 1990s, a policy analyst named Overton, working at a research organization called the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, proposed a simple way of picturing which political ideas a society considers acceptable to discuss at any given moment. Imagine every possible policy on a single subject, arranged along a line, ranging from one extreme to the other. At any point in time, only a narrow segment of that full line sits within what Overton called the window of political possibility, the range of ideas that a mainstream politician can openly support without facing serious professional damage for having said it out loud. Ideas outside that window are not necessarily wrong, and they are not necessarily fringe forever. They are simply at this particular moment unacceptable to propose in ordinary political conversation without real cost to whoever proposes them. Overton's central insight was that the window itself moves over time, sliding to include ideas that were once unthinkable and sliding to exclude ideas that were once completely uncontroversial, and that this movement happens gradually, shaped by shifting public opinion, sustained advocacy, and the slow accumulation of changed minds, rather than by any single vote or decision. A colleague renamed the concept the Overton window after Overton's death in 2003, and the idea has since become a common way of describing how policies once considered radical can eventually become mainstream, not because a persuasive argument suddenly appeared, but because years of sustained public conversation gradually shifted where the boundaries of the window happened to sit. Advocates for a policy far outside the current window sometimes deliberately argue for something even more extreme than what they actually want, a tactic intended to shift the whole window in their preferred direction, making their real, more moderate goal look comparatively reasonable by contrast once it is placed beside the more extreme position. The window rarely moves because of one argument, brilliant or otherwise. It moves the way a shoreline moves, a little every day, until the coastline nobody was watching closely turns out to be somewhere else entirely. In New York, in the years following the Second World War, comedians working the Broadway theater circuit developed a habit of gathering at a delicatessen called Lindy's late at night to talk shop. And among the topics they returned to often was a rough rule of thumb about their own careers. A comedy show that had already been running for a long time was likely to keep running for roughly as long again, while a show that had only just opened remained fragile and unpredictable, as likely to close within the week as to become a long-running hit. The observation was showbiz folklore, reported in print for the first time in 1964, long before anyone had worked out a rigorous reason why it might actually be true. Decades later, the mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot found a genuine mathematical logic underneath the folklore, and the writer Nassim Nicholas Taleb popularized the idea further and gave it the name it carries now, the Lindy effect. The core claim applies specifically to things that do not physically age or wear out the way a living body does: ideas, books, technologies, institutions, works of art. For this category of non-perishable things, the argument runs future life expectancy tends to be roughly proportional to current age. A book that has already been in print and widely read for 100 years has on average a longer remaining future ahead of it than a book published only last month, not because the older book is guaranteed to be superior, but because it has already survived a century of changing tastes, competing books, and shifting fashions that the newer book has not yet been tested against at all. A technology still in wide daily use after a century, a philosophical idea still being seriously debated after 2,000 years, has each already passed a very long, very demanding filter that newer competitors have not yet faced even once. Passing that filter for another year does not use up the achievement, it adds directly to it, extending the expected future all over again. The old, in this narrow but genuine sense, is not evidence of fragility, so much as evidence of a thing already tested against nearly everything that manages to kill new things quickly. Bayes was an English minister who spent much of his life thinking quietly about probability, and who never published the theorem that would eventually carry his name to nearly every corner of modern statistics and science. He died in 1761, and it was a friend, Prize, who found his unfinished mathematical notes among his papers, recognized what they contained, and arranged for the work to be published 2 years later, after Bayes was already gone and unaware of what his private notebook was about to become. The theorem itself answers a very ordinary question with unusual precision. Given what you already believed before, and given a new piece of evidence that has just arrived, exactly how much should that new evidence change your belief? Not whether to throw out everything you thought before, and not whether to ignore the new evidence and keep your prior belief exactly as it was either. Bayes' approach sits carefully between those two extremes, treating belief as something that should shift in proportion to the strength of new evidence, weighted against how strong the belief already was, and how reliable the new evidence actually is. A doctor interpreting a positive test result uses a version of this reasoning correctly when they weigh that positive result against how rare the disease already is in the wider population, rather than treating the single positive test as though it settles the question entirely on its own. A juror weighing a new piece of testimony against everything already heard in a trial is doing something similar, whether or not they would ever describe it using Bayes' name. The underlying discipline is the same in each case. Update, do not overwrite, and do not ignore. Most everyday thinking fails at one of these two extremes, rather than actually finding the middle. Some beliefs get treated as unmovable certainties, held with identical confidence, no matter what new evidence eventually arrives to challenge them. Others swing wildly with whatever the most recent headline happened to say, discarding a well-earned prior belief for a single new data point that on its own may not deserve nearly that much weight. A well-tuned mind changes by degrees, not by whiplash, and rarely all at once. None of these models fix a decision on their own. A rule about competence does not choose your career for you, and a law about measures does not run your company for you. What they offer is smaller and more durable, a set of angles, tested by people who thought hard about hard problems, available to you the next time your own thinking runs out of road. Notice, too, how often the same shape reappeared under different names. A boundary respected instead of pushed against. A step taken backward before a step is taken forward. A system given room to bend so that it does not break. Cultures and centuries apart, different thinkers kept arriving at versions of the same handful of moves, which is itself a kind of evidence. Not proof exactly, but a pattern worth noticing. You will not remember all of these by name, and that is fine. Frameworks fade the way most facts do. What tends to stay, longer than the label, is a quiet shift in the way a problem gets held up to the light once you have seen it held that way before. The next time a decision refuses to resolve itself, some version of one of these models may surface on its own, without you reaching for it, the way a half-remembered melody returns before you recall its name. That, more than any single model, is what the thinkers this episode has followed were actually after. Not a longer list of rules to obey, a mind that has been handed a few more ways of turning a problem over before deciding it is finally solved. Charlie Munger called the whole collection a lattice work, tools hung on the same wall so that whichever the job requires, the right one is already close at hand. Wherever you are settling in tonight, or wherever this found you, thank you for spending this time with these ideas. The models will keep, so in their own quiet way, will you.